Hey folks, just want to let you know beforehand that parts of this video might not make much sense unless you watch the previous video on the topic that I made. So you might want to watch that first, but well, if you don't, I don't control you, do what you want. Let's go. With everything that we just learned from that rant about settler colonialism, we're going to watch David Pakman's take on this, and I'm going to show you. I haven't even watched it yet, and I know this is going to happen because, he's just going to use the typical sort of progressive Zionist talking points where it's all the right wing's fault, etc., etc. I'm going to show you how to apply the settler colonial framework to these arguments.
All right, I want to start today with what's happening in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where once again we have another major
conflict. It's not a conflict. That's like saying the black versus white conflict in apartheid South Africa. It's like saying the conflict between the Polish resistance and the Nazis. It's one side oppressing people who were the original inhabitants of that land, which they stole through conquest and through essentially dividing it and claiming it was theirs. It's not a conflict. There is no conflict here. One side has a just cause, the other does not. Very simple.
Flare up, and no clarity at this time whether this will be on the order of weeks or months in duration, or possibly even longer. Now, normally I would just jump right into the story and what's going on, and for a 70-year conflict at the hands of genocidal evil Israel, Zionist pig that you are, or it's financial reasons or whatever. Okay,
it was financial reasons, by the way. He didn't talk about Israel for 2 years for financial reasons. He was getting bad likes in the videos. It was alienating his audience. He was worried about people unsubscribing and stop not giving him money anymore, etc., etc. So it was.
I'm under no illusion that those people will be satisfied with this segment unless I unilaterally put the sole blame for a 70-year conflict at the hands of genocidal evil Israel.
Yes, how would you not do that? See, this is the sort of framework, right? The only way that he and other people with these same talking points can justify this is if they ignore the problem of settler colonialism entirely, right? Sure, Israel has done bad, but Palestine isn't innocent here. The problem is not whether individual Israelis, individual Palestinians, or even individual authorities or even like the authority of Palestine or the authorities of Israel are at fault here. The problem is the very nature of, immigrants coming in and then saying, 58% of this is ours now, and we're going to take as much as we can possibly get away with from the original inhabitants who were here before us, and we're going to expel you, or as many of you as we can get away with from this land that we now claim is ours. They avoid that. That's all they can do.
And anyone who knows me knows I would never give such childish black and white takes on any issue.
Childish black and white take. It's actually the only viable take. But David Pakman and everyone like him don't even know what fucking settler colonialism is. And if you talked about it with them, they would not only be dumbfounded, they would just repeat the same fucking talking points that are completely destroyed by it.
Those people who have been emailing me saying, I deserve to lose my show because I haven't yet talked about it, I'm sure will shift to saying I should lose my show because of what I say today. This segment is not for them, clearly. There were some really wacky things being emailed to me, maybe on other platforms as well. I've really only looked at emails, but maybe things are crazy on the Discord or on Reddit. I don't know. People saying, well, clearly I'm not saying anything because I'm afraid of the blowback from taking a position my audience won't like.
Yes.
That's never stopped me before on the show. What I have said before is if there's an issue that's unnecessarily inflammatory that most of my audience seems not to care about, I would consider skipping it. But I've done dozens of segments on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. View on this, which is Israel is the only problem, and Israel in some cases even should not exist, as some people emailed me.
And see, in the framework of every single reason why I just stated, how could you possibly argue that Israel, as a separate state, as its own state, as the homeland of these settler colonists who have spent so long oppressing the people who were already living there before them, how could you possibly claim that Israel should exist? Israel has a right to exist. They frame it in these terms as if Israel is like a fucking human being, as if it has inalienable human rights, just by virtue of being proclaimed to exist. You see how easy it is to topple these talking points. If you look at them within the framework of settler colonialism, they can't defend. The only defense they could possibly have to the framework of settler colonial critical analysis is to say, so what? Might makes right. And that is fundamentally the only justification for the existence of Israel. Might makes right.
David, why does your Judaism blind you? You can't be a fair arbiter here because you're Jewish. This is the same argument that right-wingers made during the fight for gay rights, saying, of course, gay people want gay marriage. They're biased. You can't listen to them. They can't get past their personal connection to the issue. And it borders on anti-Semitic because it plays on the trope of a dual loyalty, that American Jews have a conflicting loyalty to Israel. Most Jews, of course, have never been to Israel. I've been there once 6 years ago. I don't live there. You won't be able to engage with me on things like, can't you put aside your Judaism and take the correct position?
Pacman is incorrectly thinking that people critique him on this because he's Jewish, but people critique him on this because he supports Israeli settler colonialism. Not because he's Jewish, because he is a vocal supporter of Israeli settler colonialism. Right? People act like Jews are unfairly singled out for anti-Semitic reasons for supporting Israel. Not even remotely the case. The reason why it might seem like that is because there's a lot of diaspora Jews who are some of the most vocal supporters of Israel. So of course, people are going to reply to them, right? The idea that replying to them is anti-Semitic is absurd, but that's how he's trying to frame it. Like, if you just went up to some random Jew in the street and said, hey, tell me what's your opinion on Israel. Yeah, that's wrong. But David Pacman is a fucking political commentator who has supported Israel many times in the past. So obviously it's totally fine. Talk to him about it, to critique him on it, to just in general talk about his opinion on Israel.
That's an identity politics rabbit hole. It's trash, and I don't engage in that. So I want to focus on what's been taking place. Now, one last thing. And again, I hate that I even have to do this, but you should see what I stepped into in my inbox when I got in this morning. I also got emails saying, David, you're motivated by money. So you want to avoid losing money if you give an unpopular take.
Absolutely.
And so that's why you're hiding your view on the subject. And some people writing and saying, David, you used to cover the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because you had a smaller audience and you made less money. Now there's too much money at stake. I'm going to ignore for a second, again, the anti-Semitic trope of Jews and money to say that over time.
Anti-Semitic trope of Jews and money, right? He tries to frame everything, this dishonest little slime. He tries to frame everything as anti-Semitism. People aren't saying that he wants money because he's Jewish, right? They're saying that he wants money because every single fucking time he puts out a controversial take on an issue, he never talks about it again. This is one of them. 2 years without a video on Israel-Palestine. He supported the coup in Bolivia and then immediately wiped his hands of it, never talked about it again since October 2019. Dishonest bullshit. Completely dishonest bullshit. Like the idea that you can't accuse someone who very clearly selectively chooses their topics based on things like popularity and audience reception is chasing the money. Someone with the most centrist bog standard takes ever is chasing the money. The idea that that's anti-Semitic is absurd. The idea that you cannot say that Jewish people do the sorts of things that it's okay to accuse other people of because they are Jewish and for no reason more, and it's automatically anti-Semitic if you do, is obviously absurd, right? Like, you could point out many other circumstances where people on YouTube or whatever have avoided topics because they want money and they're not Jewish. But the second that someone points out a very, very real example of David Pacman doing this, everyone's an anti-Semite. Everyone's a fucking anti-Semite. Just ridiculous. Already we're 5 fucking minutes in and it's just absurd. This fucking guy.
Successful financial considerations are
how dishonest he is.
Less a part of anything I do at this point. I never chose stories based on money. I chose stories based on, do I feel like talking about it? Do I feel like I have something to add? Is this something my audience would be interested in? That's it. It's just my show and I pick the stories every day. Financial incentives never dictated story choice. They especially don't right now. And by the way, if lots of people are interested in the topic, then doing the story would bring money no matter what I say. Hate watching is still watching. It still makes just as much money. So it's not only an incorrect take, it's wrong on the facts as well. All of that now out of the way. All of the reasons why I've not doing a story now out of the way. Ways to maybe say the catalysts are more two-sided. I could, but they feel disingenuous to me. The narrow catalyst for this flare-up is Israel. The first is that a squad of Israeli police officers entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. This is a very volatile place. I was there a few years ago. Non-Muslims are only allowed at Al-Aqsa during certain time periods. Then, I don't know what's going on now. I was lucky to be there at just the right time. We were allowed in. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is controlled by the Jordanian Authority within the Old City of Jerusalem. One of the most interesting places I've ever been. The Old City in general and Al-Aqsa itself, fascinating historical places. A squad of Israeli police officers entered the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, brushed the Palestinian Jordanian attendants aside, went across the courtyard and cut the cables to loudspeakers that were broadcasting prayers during Ramadan. Disastrous idea. Now, why did they do it? The explanation is the Israeli president, not prime minister, the Israeli president was delivering a speech at the Western Wall on.
By the way, that's literally an invasion, a military invasion of territory that is not Israeli. Frame it for what it is. It's a military invasion by a settler colonial state of territory that somehow still isn't theirs by some miracle.
Israeli Memorial Day, you had Ramadan prayers conflicting with a Memorial Day speech, so the speakers were cut. It's a terrible idea. Now, you can argue, and unfortunately, this is how intractable this conflict is, where many of us would say, oh, come on, just, give this speech somewhere else or turn down the music or whatever, turn down the prayers or whatever. That's not the way this conflict works. And if you've been following the 70 plus...
Conflict. What's the root of the conflict, David? Why does it exist? Is it settler colonialism, bud? Oh, he's not going to talk about it.
Your history of it, you would see why this explodes. But I understand thinking, how is that what was the first catalyst. Then we had the upcoming eviction of 6 families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. That led to protests. Then there was a police raid on the Al-Aqsa Mosque on May 7th. Police officers with tear gas, stun grenades, rubber tip.
Why does he just like glosses over the eviction like it's not a big deal? Another great example of settler colonialism, right? Israel, for example, comes up to people in their houses and says, hey, we wrote on this piece of paper that your land is ours, so it's ours now. Leave. And then they send in the military and the police to force them to leave. Another great example of settler colonialism. Very, very traditional, actually. That's basically how the British especially justified colonialism. They would go to an area, they would see the people live there, and they would say, well, they haven't built fences around it. So technically, we can build fences and then it's ours, and we can make ourselves a piece of paper and it's ours. Very traditional stuff there, Israel. Great job.
Went into the mosque compound around 8 p.m. local time, and this set off hours of clashes with protesters. There were hundreds of injuries, according to medics that were on site. As reported by the New York Times, the police say that the stone throwers started it. Worshippers are saying the Israeli police started it. And then things...
Doesn't fucking matter who started it. The people who started it are the ones who evicted people living on their own land so that it can be stolen by settler colonists, as they have been doing for 7 decades.
Exploded as usual. Each side has their own view on who the real wrongdoers are.
Each side. And it's both sides. Both sides, folks. Always both fucking sides, isn't it, David?
Who is merely reacting to the other side, another intractable a bedrock of every single one of these flare-ups. And there's plenty to go around. Dozens and dozens of Hamas rockets coming over from Gaza, even reaching Tel Aviv. Israel doing bombings, as is always the case. Israel's actions leading to more death. Now, let me say one thing about this whole disproportionate response thing that often is mentioned. Yes, Israel's response is disproportionate.
Disproportionate. Israel is not responding. For one, Hamas was responding to Israel. For two, this whole disproportionate response thing doesn't fucking matter. As I said earlier, when you look at this with a settler colonial framework, one of these countries is an occupier. Okay, including of every single inch of land that they claim to be theirs. They are an occupier. The other side isn't. The other side, regardless of how flawed they may be, regardless of how shitty their ideology may be, they are a resistance to this occupation. So when you look at it with the correct settler colonial framework, everything changes, right? This framing that he's going for, right? Where, damn it, Israel, why'd you do disproportionate? If only you had been proportionate, everything would have been fine. It's dishonest from the very beginning. It's bullshit. And using it, even if you're well-meaning, is doing a disservice to the Palestinian cause.
That's absolutely true. Israel is far better armed.
As I said earlier, if Palestine had the same size of military, if it was equally armed, if it had the upper hand in the conflict, its cause would still be just. It wouldn't magically have an unjust cause just because it's more powerful militarily. The reason why Israel's cause is unjust, the reason why what it's doing is unjust, is because the fundamental base of the Israeli state is unjust. It's a settler colonial state, stolen, which was formed on the basis of denying the vast majority of the inhabitants of the region self-determination, formed on the basis of ethnic supremacy and the exclusion of people who are not believed to be part of that ethnicity, regardless of how much Israelis today say, they have equal rights. Why'd you expel almost a fucking million of them then?
Than the Hamas terrorists in Gaza. That's absolutely true. And whenever this happens, there tend to be more deaths as a result of Israeli action. That's absolutely true, and that's horrible. I think that we should also be honest with ourselves. That some of the people who say, well, if 6 Palestinians die and 1 Israeli dies, it's a disproportionate response. I don't think they would be pleased if the numbers were the same. I mean, would we really be seeing a different reaction?
No, you wouldn't. And for exactly the reasons that I just said. You see this? You see how easy it is to deal with these people and their cut and pasted talking points, their cut and pasted sort of progressive Zionist talking points. If you just look at it with a settler colonial framework, if the death toll was in the other way, right? Would the situation be different? Yes, because the fundamental basis of this conflict is different. One side has a just cause, the other side does not. Simple. Very, very simple. It's like saying if black people in South Africa were killing six white people for every 1 dead black person, that would mean that apartheid was justified. No, it wouldn't. Okay? Very fucking simple. So easy to deal with this garbage. Like, God, if you told him this live, he would look at you flabbergasted. I doubt he's ever heard anyone tell him something like this before. I doubt he even knows what settler colonialism is. they're so sheltered from even having to talk about this because the discussion is just taken so further away from the actual root of the problem, so far away from the actual root of the problem, they never have to engage with it. That's why we need to talk about it in those terms.
From people, if 12 Palestinians and 12 Israelis died, would that no longer be a factor? I don't think so. So of course the response is disproportionate. Disproportionate responses are a common thing in many conflicts, ethnic, political, military, etc. It doesn't mean it's good, but to focus on that when obviously the side that's better armed is likely to do more damage, I don't think it helps us understand what's going on any better. Now then, Israel did another completely harebrained thing, blowing up a building in which the Associated Press was working in Gaza, saying there were Hamas there. Now, maybe there were Hamas, maybe they weren't. Israeli authorities did call and say, get out because we're going to hit this building. Whatever is the case, Hamas is in all sorts of different places, and it just seems idiotic to me to target this building because it does exactly what Israel's opponents want to say Israel does, which is suppress criticism and news of what's happening in Gaza. And in some literal sense, that's exactly what happens when you blow up a building out of which the AP is working. So,
has he thought maybe Israel actually does do that? They do, by the way. That's why they blew it up. His brain just cannot connect two and two. He thinks, it's a harebrained move that just plays into the narrative. It proves the narrative true. It proves the narrative that he just said true. It's literally the biggest smoking gun example of this so-called talking point that he just went over true, okay? And he doesn't have a single spark in his brain that connects the dots.
Disastrous idea. Absolutely condemnable. So let's go through these things first and I'll tell you where I stand, and pay close attention because again, I'm not going to engage in responses that mischaracterize what I say. I am and have been against evictions and settlements, period, for the 25 years I've been following this conflict. There's no mitigator. I'm against it. I condemn it. This current Israeli government makes me sick and has.
He's against evictions and settlements, and the current Israeli government makes him sick. Problem with that is all of Israel is settlements. All of Israel is land that Arab people were evicted from. And then he does the thing that I'd said earlier where you blame the Israeli government as if this is their problem rather than the fundamental basis of the Israeli state, rather than its very nature as a settler colonial entity that has been doing settler colonialism non-stop even before it was founded. And even worse, since it was founded. You see how relevant all of this is. You see the incredible, like undeniable relevance of everything that I said in the earlier segment to this. How impossible it is for them to reply to the framing, to reply to a framework of analysis that actually considers settler colonialism.
For a long time, and settlements are a big part of that. One thing that is important and that tons of people are missing are that much like the Palestinian people are different from Hamas and the Palestinian Authority.
The thing is, even if we say, okay, the people are different from the government, right? Which he's definitely going to say. The fundamental basis of Hamas's cause, which is self-determination, regardless of all the shit that they have tacked onto that, which is obviously reprehensible, like anti-Semitism, Islamism, etc., the fundamental basis of their cause is self-determination, the Palestinian self-determination in their own land, which has been divided by Israel. And the fundamental cause of the Israeli state, whether it's governed by Netanyahu or anyone else, is the exact opposite of that. Settler colonialism of the Palestinian people. There is no both sides here. There is no, these two things are the same. They are not the same. They are not even remotely the same.
And the ultra-radical Palestinians, the Israeli people, Israel as a country, and the current administration are three different things. And during the Iraq war years, some Europeans wrongly saw all Americans as warmongers who wanted to go to Iraq. We all understood why that didn't make sense between the Trump administration, the United States as a country, and Americans as individuals. And yet more than half the emails I received about don't seem to understand or make that distinction between the Netanyahu administration, Israel as a country, and the Israeli people.
There's no distinction. As I just said, there is no distinction. But do you see how we can just, every single talking point he's using, we can refer back to the original lecture that I gave on settler colonialism. Every single talking point. Do you see how important it is to not let him frame it in this way, to not let them frame it in this way? It is settler fucking colonialism. That's what it always has been. That's what it always will be until Palestine becomes one state again, or until it becomes one state for the first time, however you want to frame it, until it becomes one political entity with equal rights for everyone. It's always going to be the same. As long as the Israeli state exists as a Jewish supremacist project, as it always has, as it always will, this is how it's going to be.
Understand or make that distinction between the Netanyahu administration, Israel as a country, and the Israeli people, using the three terms interchangeably.
The Israeli people, by and large, support genocide. They support keeping all of their land that they've stolen for themselves. That they support keeping all the people who they stole the land from out of it. Of course, and you expect that, right? It's a settler colonial state. It's settler colonial ideology. Same thing. If you ask some American in 1850, hey, would you think about giving some of this land back to the natives? He tell you, no, of course not. How could you even say that? It's the same it's our land. We stole it. It was our divine right. Besides, we help them. They have so many rights in our state. They're way better off than they were before. It's the same fucking shit.
And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on. How can we even have a remotely sensible conversation about this conflict if you interchangeably assign blame or characterize three separate entities, the current administration, Israel as a country, and the Israeli people as one and the same? The evictions from East Jerusalem are at the heart of this, and I'm 100% against that. They are illegal by international law, period. Settlers are radical extremists. I share nothing with them. I am diametrically opposed.
You support... No, this is another framing. He shares nothing with the settlers. He supports the existence of the state of Israel. He supports the settler colonial project of Israel. He supports the Jewish supremacist state of Israel. He supports its expulsion of the original inhabitants. He supports its division of their land. He supports, its continued oppression of them. The only difference between him and them is that he's not out there doing it physically. He supports, the premise behind it completely. What these settlers are doing is the extension of the ideology that David Pakman supports.
Settlers are a tiny fraction of Israeli Jews who are just a portion of world Jews. Unless someone says, I'm for the settlements, I assume that they are not, because this is such a radical and relatively fringe group. Settlers are, in a sense, massive provocateurs, shameless.
Relatively fringe group supported by the Israeli government since like the late 80s, early 90s? Not just by Netanyahu, not just by Likud.
Ones at that, and sadly right now...
Like the idea that the settlements are even the fundamental issue, right? The settlements are primarily in the West Bank, which has been under fucking Israeli military rule for decades. It's under martial law by Israel. Even if they weren't making settlements there, come on, everything is settler colonialism here. It's so easy to point to.
The Netanyahu government is benefiting from the settlers, and so they are allowing this to happen. Second, I am 100% against the Netanyahu government, which I believe is allowing this to happen for the benefit of Benjamin Netanyahu. The depraved and disgusting right-wing prime minister, Netanyahu, knows his days are numbered. He was unable to form a government, so he is allowing this to happen now because this is how he operates. Look at the chaos, you need me. He pulled this before an election some years ago. Now, this is when maybe some people want me to start saying, who is to blame and to what degree? David, please say this conflict is 99% Israel, or say it's all Hamas, or you are a Hamas sympathizer. Nothing is that simple. What I will tell you is what I see as the most likely.
Both sides, always has to be both sides. This is no different to both sizing South African apartheid. It is no different. Absolutely no difference. There's a fucking reason why Israel was one of the apartheid regime's prime supporters, economically and diplomatically, because they knew that they were doing something very similar in Palestine. You don't both sides this. There's no both sides. It doesn't matter how abhorrent the terrorists on the other sides are or whatever you want to call them. It doesn't fucking matter, because the fundamentals of that cause, the fundamental relation of settler colonialism inherently means that your cause is unjust and their cause
Communism is based.
The issue is everything that they've tacked onto it.
Path to peace for the long term. And it requires both Netanyahu and Likud not to be in power on the Israeli side, and somehow for Hamas to be removed from power in Gaza, but not replaced by Hezbollah. So here's my perspective. If you said, what is the most likely path to peace? And this is why I didn't have much to say initially in this, because fundamentally the path to peace has not changed in my view. So starting with the big picture, anyone who thinks that
He's going to talk about a two-state solution, right? I just went over again. A two-state solution is fundamentally unjust because it implies that the land that Israel is on, that the land that Israel wants in a two-state solution is not stolen settler colonial land by people who stole it from people who lived there beforehand, which they did. There you go. Another fundamental issue with the way that he's going to frame it. But, it seems rational to idiotic liberals with no analytical framework, no understanding of history, no nothing. That's why they can get away with this.
Should be no Palestinian state in the future is just not a productive participant here. The Palestinians need a state of their own, a contiguous one, which I will get to. Anyone who thinks there should be no country of Israel is also not a productive participant. And if you really want to see a situation where many people would die, it would be a real attempt by serious players to make Israel no longer a country. So the Palestinian people...
He's framing it as you're basically insane if you think about this in terms of decolonization, rather than in terms of a conquered people giving up something massive to their conquerors.
Deserve a state and to live in peace, and the Israeli people do as well. And right now, neither side is being led by those who benefit from peace or who...
It doesn't matter about right now. Any sort of solution to this conflict, even if it's this ridiculous two-state solution, which is obviously unjust from the get-go, is going to take decades, right? So pointing out who's in power now is irrelevant. Opinion can change fast, right? People turn against the two-state solution in like 15 years. There's absolutely no fucking reason to think that the one-state solution cannot, there can't be a shift in public opinion, especially if international of other countries start talking about it, that the one state solution cannot become viable. Because the greatest support for the two-state solution has nothing to do with it being a better solution and everything to do with, one, Israel obviously preferring it because it means that they get to keep the land that they stole and they know that it's a relatively good deal for them. And two, the fact that it's just been so internationally pervasive for so long. It would be very easy to change. And that would change opinion in Palestine itself as well.
Want it. Until that changes, nothing will change. So the first question is, who's in charge in a hypothetical peaceful situation? In Israel, it's not Netanyahu and it's not Likud. Okay? On the Palestinian side, Hamas must be replaced by a more secular Palestinian authority immediately. Hezbollah replacing Hamas won't get us to serious peace possibilities. Does Mahmoud Abbas have a role to play there?
And it's like, I don't know, why is he even talking about Hezbollah? Why did he even bring them up? Like, see, they try to frame this in terms of like some international terrorist conspiracy against Israel all the time.
Currently overseeing the West Bank. Maybe I'm open to that. It doesn't seem Hamas is open to that. When you look at how long Abbas has been around, I think you can also increasingly make the case that Abbas is not a likely arbiter to a longer term peace. Abbas has also given, lie-riddled speeches at the UN. So has Benjamin Netanyahu. To the extent that Abbas might be a productive partner, I'm open to it being a Mahmoud Abbas-led coalition government, West Bank and Gaza. But I don't know how feasible that really is. In all likelihood, you are going to need to have the law of return for Jews to Israel maintained. And
there you go. He wants more settler colonialism. People, just based on their ethnicity, should be able to come and keep colonizing this land that was stolen from its original inhabitants by settler colonists, justified through nothing more than an imagined ethnic connection with people from 2,000 years ago, and might makes right. There's no such thing as a right of return, like Jews outside of Israel to Israel, unless they literally are actually from the land of Palestine or Israel or whatever you want to call it, right? You don't have a right of return to a place that you nor anyone for fucking 10, 15, 20 generations has ever stepped foot in. Ridiculous. Settler colonial ideology right here. It's nothing but settler colonialism.
A law of return established for the future Palestinian state. Now, the entire point of Israel is, since Jews...
But only for the future Palestinian state, right? Not the Israeli state where many of them were fucking evicted from.
Were kicked out and discriminated of so many parts of the world for so long. That's a place Jews know they can go, even if Hungary turns extremely right-wing anti-Semitic or whatever.
Again, you cannot justify settler colonialism and the dominance of another people with the idea that some other people in some other place oppressed you, okay? Regardless of how horrific the Holocaust was, nothing justifies going ahead and doing similar shit to other people. If there was any sort of just solution to creating a Jewish homeland, as I said earlier, the only option would have been to do it in Germany. But, it had to be in the Holy Land. It had to be in a place that innately meant that the people doing, establishing this state would be doing colonialism against the people who already live there.
Whatever the case may be. There also is going to have to be, I believe, some ability for Palestinians to return to Israel. Something's going to have to be conceded. Mathematically, and this is something Yasser Arafat talked about in the 90s, it's not going to be 5 million Palestinians. It's just not going to happen. So we need a combination of...
He's quoting Yasser Arafat. As I said earlier, in the other part of this stream, Yasser Arafat was a compromiser. Yasser Arafat was basically a figurehead of a defeated people, of a conquered people, arguing the terms of a surrender. It was not an even thing. These were not even discussions. Him saying that is essentially him saying, oh, we're going to have to give something to the Nazis in exchange for peace.
Some reasonable Palestinian return to what will be the state of Israel. Certainly the Palestinian state will be able to decide who is allowed to go there as well. Anyone who wants to move back to Gaza or the West Bank would be free to do so if the Palestinian Authority wants to allow it. Now, Ehud Barak in the past proposed a symbolic number of Palestinian return to Israel and significant financial reparation. That's something that could be looked at. But that's more details once we get past sort of the big questions. In terms of the land, what are the borders, right? I believe the most likely path to peace will come with something that is more or less the Clinton proposed borders, which is similar to a lot of the recent ideas, not the Trump ideas. Forget Trump.
Okay. If he's trying to frame this, he's operating from a false premise. Everything that he's talking about is from a false premise that involves a complete ignorance or ignoring intentionally the fundamental issue of settler colonialism. Like the fundamental idea that the two-state solution is just some sort of ideal to strive for is itself flawed for all the reasons that I explained earlier. But he's operating from this position where that is like something that you literally cannot critique. These people operate from, they don't have any sort of analytical framework, nor do they want you to have one.
Anything Trump said is in the trash. The Palestinian territory would include the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Yes, East Jerusalem. There are some problems with exactly what the limits of East Jerusalem would be because they are disputed, but let's imagine if we got to this point, they could be agreed upon. East Jerusalem would become the capital of the Palestinian state. I think that has to be conceded. And the caveat would be the Jewish quarter of East Jerusalem should remain under Israeli sovereignty. We could do just a whole show on this, but if you look at the desecration.
David Pakman is an ethno-nationalist. You can't look at this and say that he is not an ethno-nationalist. Doesn't matter if you frame it in progressive terms. David Pakman is an ethno-nationalist. Yet people are talking like random land back like groups in the US are ethno-nationalists. You want to look at an ethno-nationalist, look at this guy. Proposing an ethno-nationalist solution, like a settler colonial ethno-nationalist solution, so-called solution to settler colonialism. No different, as I said 1,000 times already, from saying that white people should have half of South Africa and they should be segregated from black people in that way.
Of the Jewish quarter when it was not under Israeli control from, I believe, 49 to 67. You can read more about that. I think that is a caveat. On settlements, I mean, just all settlements have to stop immediately. Israel has to agree in principle to remove settlements that can be removed and to offer meaningful land swaps for those that cannot. Now, as a practical reality, and I also go back to what Arafat said about this, not all the settlements at this point can be realistically removed. I hate that. That's disgusting.
Stalin,
but if you say, David,
Beria,
you're the
Gulag. Stalin, Beria, Gulag.
Pragmatist negotiator, morally, I have no problem with removing every settlement. And I know the talking point is, well, these are people's homes. Yes, they're people's homes that were built in violation of international law, and they never should have been built.
He just got to the fundamental issue here. It's not international law. It's that these are people, right, who came and lived and, you know, essentially took land for themselves that they not just took land for themselves, but took land for themselves exclusively and others of their ethnic group, or their imagined ethnic group exclusively, against the will of the people who lived there before them in what was previously a united region, a united land. He's framing it as international law. It's not a problem of international law. It's a simple problem of settler colonialism, all of this. You see, he understands the problem.
Communism is based.
You can see here, David Pakman gets the issue of settler colonialism from this part here. He understands it, right? But he frames it as an issue of international law. What that means is, the UN said that 58% of Israel was Palestine. What is 58% of Palestine was Israel? International law, done, right? No critical framework of that very no framework to criticize that very so-called international law that supposedly makes things just. You know, no criticism of settler colonialism in general, no framework of settler colonialism.
Communism is
no
based.
discussion of what is just and what isn't.
Yasser Arafat had the idea that keeping the larger settlements in exchange for meaningful land swaps would be okay. That's probably something that would have to be negotiated. And then certainly, on the other hand, you know, all settlements have to stop. I believe the blockade has to be lifted to Gaza. You do have to have some way of preventing weapon materials from being brought in. It has to be negotiated, but the blockade...
So Palestinians should not have weapons, but Israel should. Palestinians should not have a military, but Israel should. Do you see this fucking settler colonist piece of shit? Unbelievable.
As a sign of good faith, at least initially, has to be lifted, of course. Palestinians have to immediately, all Palestinian groups have to stop all rockets immediately, stop the tunnel building, so on and so forth. Hamas and other groups have to demilitarize Gaza as part of a peace agreement. We saw in the...
It's weird how Israel doesn't have to do any of this. It's all, you know, the military burden is all on Israel. Not the literal fascist Starship Troopers state of not on Palestine, right? It's not on the literal fascist Starship Troopers state of Israel, where basically every single Jew has to join the military and is indoctrinated into loving the military from birth. It's the colonized people under settler colonial domination who need to give up like the 1% of the military capacity that they have compared to Israel.
2-year period after the withdrawal of Israel from Gaza, but before the blockade was put in place, you know, thousands of rockets. So there has to be a demilitarization, but the Gaza blockade has to...
Thousands of rockets from a colonized people into a settler colonial state. We frame all of this stuff differently to how they want it to be framed. You have to do it. You have to do it.
To be removed. And as long as the demilitarization and no rockets are held to, the blockade has to be removed. How do you hold people to that? I don't know. That has to be figured out. And then lastly, the eventual peace agreement has to include that all claims are being renounced and it is the end of the conflict period. Because the problem we run into...
We need to legitimize settler colonialism by saying, okay, people who established a nation state here 70 years ago after expelling the original inhabitants, etc., etc. This is ours now, and you have to promise that you'll never claim it again. Why? What's the basis for this? Might makes right. Nothing more. It's simple. Might makes right. You can't even claim that it's due to the oppression of Jews because the fundamental thing that the mass exodus of Jews to Israel was reacting to was the Holocaust. Right? The Holocaust was not inflicted by Palestinians, so you can't even claim that the basis of the Israeli state is just because of that. It would be just maybe if it was in Germany not in fucking Palestine. These people had nothing to do with that.
You have some sort of an agreement in principle,
Communism is
but not
based-
all claims are renounced. And then when the agreement is violated, everybody goes back to pretending like this was never identified as the end of the conflict. If there's going to be a serious deal, once the right players come to the table, and as I already mentioned, who those are is complicated, it has to be determined that that is the end of the conflict. And in the future, that allows any violator of the agreement, either on the Israeli or the Palestinian side, to be held to account. Some non-binding thing is not going to get us what we need. If you want to react, address these specific points. All insults, anti-Semitic responses, blanket replies, like what I had over the weekend in my email, Zionist pig, it's all going to be ignored. The winners here are Netanyahu and Hamas. Chaos from which Netanyahu can say, you need me to protect you, that's a
Just a fundamentally wrong idea that, one, that the problem is Netanyahu and the right wing. No, this is the entire, all Israelis like this. They're a settler colonial state, of course. You know, the same reason why people in the US don't want the USA to be broken up. It's settler colonialism. It doesn't mean it's just that it's not. Like the framing as both sides as well. I've been over this so many times already in this stream, right? It's just a fundamental issue of settler colonialism. Everything that he's talking about is so easily dealt with by looking at it with a settler colonial framework. And that is why we need to talk about it in these terms. If you want to argue for a one-state solution, if we want to make it realistic, if we want to fundamentally change opinion on Israel-Palestine in the right way too, not just in terms of, I sympathize with Palestinians, but Israel is also just or whatever. In the right way, being that this is fundamentally an issue of settler colonialism. This is fundamentally an issue of a settler colonial state oppressing a colonized people. That is the only way that any sort of remotely acceptable and just solution could ever possibly be put forward. So yeah, fuck that. My voice hurts.